Combray, Part 4. Despite all the admiration that Monsieur Swann might profess for these figures of Giotto, it was a long time before I could find any pleasure in seeing in our schoolroom, where the copies he had brought me were hung, that charity devoid of charity, that envy who looked like nothing so much as a plate in some medical book, illustrating the compression of the glottis or uvula by a tumor in the tongue, or by the introduction of the operator's instrument, a justice whose grayish and meanly regular features were the very same as those which adorned the faces of certain good and pious and slightly withered ladies of Combray, whom I used to see at Mass, many of whom had long been enrolled in the reserve forces of injustice. But in later years I understood that the arresting strangeness, the special beauty of these frescoes, lay in the great part played in each of them by its symbols, while the fact that these were depicted not as symbols, for the thought symbolized was nowhere expressed, but as real things, actually felt or materially handled, added something more precise and more literal to their meaning, something more concrete and more striking to the lesson they imparted. And even in the case of the poor kitchen maid, was not our attention incessantly drawn to her belly by the load which filled it? And in the same way, again, are not the thoughts of men and women in agony of death often turned towards the practical, painful, obscure, internal, intestinal aspect, towards that seamy side of death, which is, as it happens, the side that death actually presents to them and forces them to feel, a side which far more closely resembles a crushing burden, a difficulty in breathing, a destroying thirst, than the abstract idea to which we are accustomed to give the name of death? There must have been a strong element of reality in those virtues and vices of Padua, since they appeared to me to be as much alive as the pregnant servant girl, while she herself appeared scarcely less allegorical than they. And, quite possibly, this lack, or seeming lack, of participation by a person's soul in the significant marks of its own special virtue has, apart from its ascetic meaning, a reality which, if not strictly psychological, may at least be called physiognomical. Later on, when in the course of my life I have had occasion to meet with, in convents for instance, literally saintly examples of practical charity, they have generally had the brisk, decided, undisturbed, and slightly brutal air of a busy surgeon, the face in which one can discern no commiseration, no tenderness at the sight of suffering humanity, and no fear of hurting it, the face devoid of gentleness or sympathy, the sublime face of true goodness. Then, while the kitchen maid, who, all unawares, made the superior qualities of Françoise shine with added lustre, just as error, by force of contrast, enhances the triumph of truth, while the kitchen maid took in coffee, which, according to Mamma, was nothing more than hot water, and then carried up to our rooms hot water which was barely tepid, I would be lying stretched out on my bed, a book in my hand, in my room, which trembled with the effort to defend its frail, transparent coolness against the afternoon sun, behind its almost closed shutters, through which, however, a reflection of the sunlight had contrived to slip in on its golden wings, remaining motionless between glass and woodwork, in a corner, like a butterfly poised upon a flower. It was hardly light enough for me to read, and my feeling of the day's brightness and splendor was derived solely from the blows struck down below in the Rue de la Cure by Camus, whom Francoise had assured that my aunt was not resting and that he might therefore make a noise. Blows struck by Camus upon some old packing cases, from which nothing would really be sent flying but the dust, though the din of them, in the resonant atmosphere that accompanies hot weather, seemed to scatter broadcast a rain of blood-red stars, and from the flies who performed for my benefit in their small concert, as it might be the chamber music of summer, evoking heat and light quite differently from an air of human music, which, if you happen to have heard it during a fine summer, will always bring that summer back to your mind. The fly's music is bound to the season by a closer, a more vital tie, born of summer days, and not to be reborn but with them, containing something of their essential nature. It not merely calls up their image in our memory, but gives us a guarantee that they do really exist, that they are close around us, immediately accessible. This dim freshness of my room was to the broad daylight of the street what the shadow is to the sunbeam, that is to say, equally luminous, and presented to my imagination the entire panorama of summer, which my senses, if I had been out walking, could have tasted and enjoyed in fragments only, and so was quite in harmony with my state of repose, which, thanks to the adventures related in my books which had just excited it, bore like a hand reposing motionless in a stream of running water the shock and animation of a torrent of activity and life. But my grandmother, even if the weather, after growing too hot, had broken and a storm or just a shower had burst over us, would come up and beg me to go outside, and as I did not wish to leave off my book, I would go on with it in the garden, under the chestnut tree, in a little sentry box of canvas and matting, in the furthest recesses of which I would sit and feel that I was hidden from the eyes of any one who might be coming to call upon the family. And then my thoughts, did not they form a similar sort of hiding hole, in the depths of which I felt I could bury myself and remain invisible, even when I was looking at what went on outside? When I saw any external object, my consciousness that I was seeing it would remain between me and it, enclosing it in a slender incorporeal outline which prevented me from ever coming directly in contact with that material form, for it would volatilize itself in some way before I could touch it, just as an incandescent body which is moved toward something wet never actually touches moisture, since it is always preceded itself by a zone of evaporation. Upon the sort of screen, patterned with different states and impressions, which my consciousness would quietly unfold while I was reading, and which ranged from the most deeply hidden aspirations of my heart to the wholly external view of the horizon spread out before my eyes at the foot of the garden, what was from the first the most permanent and the most intimate part of me, the lever whose incessant movements controlled all the rest, was my belief in the philosophic richness and beauty of the book I was reading, and my desire to appropriate these to myself, whatever the book might be. For even if I had purchased it at Combray, having seen it outside Bourage's, whose grocery lay too far from our house for Francoise to be able to deal there, as she did with Camus, but who enjoyed better custom as a stationer and bookseller, even if I had seen it, tied with string to keep it in its place in the mosaic of monthly parts and pamphlets which adorned either side of his doorway, a doorway more mysterious, more teeming with suggestion than that of a cathedral, I should have noticed and bought it there simply because I had recognized it as a book which had been well spoken of in my hearing by the schoolmaster or the school friend who, at that particular time, seemed to me to be entrusted with the secret of truth and beauty, things half felt by me, half incomprehensible, the full understanding of which was the vague but permanent object of my thoughts. Next to this central belief, which, while I was reading, would be constantly a motion from my inner self to the outer world toward the discovery of truth, came the emotions aroused in me by the action in which I would be taking part, for these afternoons were crammed with more dramatic and sensational events than occur often in a whole lifetime. These were the events which took place in the book I was reading. It is true that the people concerned in them were not what Francois would have called real people, but none of the feelings which the joys or misfortunes of a real person awaken in us can be awakened except through a mental picture of those joys or misfortunes, and the ingenuity of the first novelist lay in his understanding that, as the picture was the one essential element in the complicated structure of our emotions, so that simplification of it which consisted in the suppression, pure and simple, of real people would be a decided improvement. A real person, profoundly as we may sympathize with him, is in a great measure perceptible only through our senses, that is to say, he remains opaque, offers a dead weight which our sensibilities have not the strength to lift. If some misfortune comes to him, it is only in one small section of the complete idea we have of him that we are capable of feeling any emotion. Indeed, it is only in one small section of the complete idea he has of himself that he is capable of feeling any emotion either. The novelist's happy discovery was to think of substituting for those opaque sections, impenetrable by the human spirit, their equivalent in immaterial sections, things, that is, which the spirit can assimilate to itself. After which it matters not that the actions, the feelings of this new order of creatures appear to us in the guise of truth, since we have made them our own, since it is in ourselves that they are happening, that they are holding in thrall, while we turn over feverishly the pages of the book, our quickened breath and staring eyes. And once the novelist has brought us to that state, in which, as in all purely mental states, every emotion is multiplied tenfold, into which his book comes to disturb us as might a dream, but a dream more lucid and of a more lasting impression than those which come to us in sleep. Why then, for the space of an hour he sets free within us all the joys and sorrows in the world, a few of which only we should have to spend years of our actual life in getting to know, and the keenest, the most intense of which would never have been revealed to us, because the slow course of their development stops our perception of them. It is the same in life. The heart changes, and that is our worst misfortune. But we learn of it only from reading or by imagination, for in reality its alteration, like that of certain natural phenomena, is so gradual that, even if we are able to distinguish successively each of its different states, we are still spared the actual sensation of change. Next to, but distinctly less intimate a part of myself than this human element, would come the view, more or less projected before my eyes, of the country in which the action of the story was taking place, which made a far stronger impression on my mind than the other, the actual landscape which would meet my eyes when I raised them from my book. In this way, for 2 consecutive summers, I used to sit in the heat of our Combray garden, sick with a longing inspired by the book I was then reading, for a land of mountains and rivers, where I could see an endless vista of sawmills, where beneath the limpid currents fragments of wood lay mouldering in beds of watercress, and near by, rambling and clustering along low walls, purple flowers and red. And since there was always lurking in my mind the dream of a woman who would enrich me with her love, that dream in those 2 summers used to be quickened with the freshness and coolness of running water. And whoever she might be, the woman whose image I called to mind, purple flowers and red would at once spring up on either side of her like complementary colors. This was not only because an image of which we dream remains forever distinguished, is adorned and enriched by the association of colors not its own, which may happen to surround it in our mental picture. For the scenes in the books I read were to me not merely scenery more vividly portrayed by my imagination than any which Combray could spread before my eyes, but otherwise of the same kind, because of the selection that the author had made of them, because of the spirit of faith in which my mind would exceed and anticipate his printed word, as it might be interpreting a revelation. These scenes used to give me the impression, one which I hardly ever derived from any place in which I might happen to be, and never from our garden, that undistinguished product of the strictly conventional fantasy of the gardener whom my grandmother so despised. These scenes used to give me the impression of their being actually part of nature herself, and worthy to be studied and explored. Had my parents allowed me, when I read a book, to pay a visit to the country it described, I should have felt that I was making an enormous advance towards the ultimate conquest of truth. For even if we have the sensation of being always enveloped in, surrounded by our own soul, still it does not seem a fixed and immovable prison. Rather do we seem to be borne away with it, and perpetually struggling to pass beyond it, to break out into the world, with a perpetual discouragement as we hear endlessly all around us that unvarying sound which is no echo from without, but the resonance of a vibration from within. We try to discover in things, endeared to us on that account, the spiritual glamour which we ourselves have cast upon them. We are disillusioned, and learn that they are in themselves barren and devoid of the charm which they owed in our minds to the association of certain ideas. Sometimes we mobilize all our spiritual forces in a glittering array, so as to influence and subjugate other human beings, who, as we very well know, are situated outside ourselves, where we can never reach them. And so, if I always imagined the woman I loved as in a setting of whatever places I most longed at the time to visit, if in my secret longings it was she who attracted me to them, who opened to me the gate of an unknown world, that was not by the mere hazard of a simple association of thoughts. No, it was because my dreams of travel and of love were only moments, which I isolate artificially today as though I were cutting sections at different heights in a jet of water, rainbow flashing but seemingly without flow or motion, were only moments, were only drops in a single, undeviating, irresistible outrush of all the forces of my life. And then, as I continue to trace the outward course of these impressions from their close-packed intimate source in my consciousness, and before I come to the horizon of reality which envelops them, I discover pleasures of another kind, those of being comfortably seated, of tasting the good scent of the air, of not being disturbed by any visitor. And, when an hour chimed from the steeple of Saint Hilaire, of watching what was already spent of the afternoon fall drop by drop until I heard the last stroke which enabled me to add up the total sum, after which the silence that followed seemed to herald the beginning, in the blue sky above me, of that long part of the day still allowed me for reading, until the good dinner which Françoise was even now preparing should come to strengthen and refresh me after the strenuous pursuit of its hero through the pages of my book. And as each hour struck, it would seem to me that a few seconds only had passed since the hour before. The latest would inscribe itself close to its predecessor on the sky's surface, and I would be unable to believe that 60 minutes could be squeezed into the tiny arc of blue which was comprised between their two golden figures. Sometimes it would even happen that this precocious hour would sound 2 strokes more than the last. There must then have been an hour which I had not heard strike. Something which had taken place had not taken place for me. The fascination of my book, a magic as potent as the deepest slumber, had stopped my enchanted ears, and had obliterated the sound of that golden bell from the azure surface of the enveloping silence. Sweet Sunday afternoons beneath the chestnut tree in our Combray garden, from which I was careful to eliminate every commonplace incident of my actual life, replacing them by a career of strange adventures and ambitions in a land watered by living streams. You still recall those adventures and ambitions to my mind when I think of you, and you embody and preserve them by virtue of having little by little drawn round and enclosed them, while I went on with my book and the heat of the day declined, in the gradual crystallization, slowly altering in form and dappled with a pattern of chestnut leaves, of your silent, sonorous, fragrant, limpid hours. Sometimes I would be torn from my book in the middle of an afternoon by the gardener's daughter, who came running like a mad thing, overturning an orange tree in its tub, cutting a finger, breaking a tooth, and screaming out, "They're coming! They're coming!" so that Françoise and I should run too and not miss anything of the show. That was on days when the cavalry stationed in Combray went out for some military exercise, going, as a rule, by the Rue Saint Hildegarde, while our servants, sitting in a row on their chairs outside the garden railings, stared at the people of Combray taking their Sunday walks, and were stared at in return. The gardener's daughter, through the gap which there was between 2 houses far away in the Avenue de la Guerre, would have spied the glitter of helmets. The servants then hurried in with their chairs, for when the troopers filed through the Rue Saint Hildegarde they filled it from side to side, and their jostling horses scraped against the walls of the houses, covering and drowning the pavements like banks which present too narrow a channel to a river in flood. "Poor children!" Françoise would exclaim, in tears, almost before she had reached the railings. "Poor boys, to be mown down like grass in a meadow! It's just shocking to think of," she would go on, laying a hand over her heart, where presumably she had felt the shock. A fine sight, isn't it, Madame Francoise? All these young fellows not caring two straws for their lives, the gardener would ask, just to draw her, and he would not have spoken in vain. Not caring for their lives, is it? Why, what in the world is there that we should care for if it's not our lives, the only gift the Lord never offers us a second time? Oh dear, oh dear, you're right all the same. It's quite true, they don't care. I can remember them in '70. In those wretched wars they've no fear of death left in them. They're nothing more nor less than madmen, and then they aren't worth the price of a rope to hang them with. They're not men any more, they're lions. For, by her way of thinking, to compare a man with a lion, which she used to pronounce lion, was not at all complimentary to the man. The Rue Sainte Hildegarde turned too sharply for us to be able to see people approaching at any distance, and it was only through the gap between those two houses in the Avenue de la Guerre that we could still make out fresh helmets racing along towards us and flashing in the sunlight. The gardener wanted to know whether there were still many to come, and he was thirsty besides, with the sun beating down upon his head. So then, suddenly his daughter would leap out, as though from a beleaguered city, would make a sortie, turn the street corner, and, having risked her life 100 times over, reappear and bring us, with a jug of licorice water, the news that there were still at least 1,000 of them, pouring along without a break from the direction of Thierry and Méséglise. Francoise and the gardener, having made up their difference, would discuss the line to be followed in case of war. "Don't you see, Francoise," he would say, "revolution would be better, because then no one would need to join in unless he liked." "Oh yes, I can see that, certainly. It's more straightforward." The gardener believed that as soon as the war was declared they would stop all the railways. "Yes, to be sure, so we shan't get away," said Francoise. And the gardener would assent with, "Ay, they're the cunning ones," for he would not allow that war was anything but a kind of trick which the state attempted to play on people, or that there was a man in the world who would not run away from it if he had the chance to do so. But Francoise would hasten back to my aunt, and I would return to my book, and the servants would take their places again outside the gate to watch the dust settle on the pavement, and the excitement caused by the passage of the soldiers subside. Long after order had been restored, an abnormal tide of humanity would continue to darken the streets of Combray, and in front of every house, even of those where it was not, as a rule, done, the servants and sometimes even the masters would sit and stare, festooning their doorsteps with a dark irregular fringe, like the border of shells and seaweed which a stronger tide than usual leaves on the beach, as though trimming it with embroidered crape when the sea itself has retreated. Except on such days as these, however, I would, as a rule, be left to read in peace. But the interruption which a visit from Swann once made, and the commentary which he then supplied to the course of my reading, which had brought me to the work of an author quite new to me called Bergotte, had this definite result, that for a long time afterwards it was not against a wall gay with spikes of purple blossom, but on a wholly different background, the porch of a Gothic cathedral, that I would see, outlined, the figure of one of the women of whom I dreamed. I heard Bergotte spoken of for the first time by a friend older than myself, for whom I had a strong admiration, a precious youth of the name of Bloch. Hearing me confess my love of the Nuit d'Octobre, he had burst out in a bray of laughter, like a bugle call, and told me, by way of warning, "You must conquer your vile taste for Alfred de Musset, Esquire. He is a bad egg, one of the very worst, a pretty detestable specimen. I am bound to admit, nevertheless," he added graciously, "that he, and even the man Racine, did, each of them, once in his life, compose a line which is not only fairly rhythmical, but has also what is in my eyes the supreme merit of meaning absolutely nothing. One is La Blanche Ourson et la Blanche Camire, and the other La Fille du Minot et du Pacifique. They were submitted to my judgment as evidence for the defence of the two runagates, in an article by my very dear master, Father Lecomte, who is found pleasing in the sight of the immortal gods. By which token, here is a book which I have not the time just now to read, a book recommended, it would seem, by that colossal fellow. He regards, or so they tell me, its author, one Bergot, Esquire, as a subtle scribe, more subtle, indeed, than any beast of the field, and albeit he exhibits on occasion a critical pacifism, a tenderness in suffering fools, for which it is impossible to account, and hard to make allowance, still his word has weight with me, as it were the Delphic oracle. Read you then this lyrical prose, and, if the titanic master builder of rhythm who composed Begovit and the Lévrier du Magnus speaks not falsely, then, by Apollo, you may taste, even you, my master, the ambrosial joys of Olympus. It was in an ostensible vein of sarcasm that he had asked me to call him, and that he himself called me, my master. But, as a matter of fact, we each derived a certain amount of satisfaction from the mannerism, being still at the age in which one believes that one gives a thing real existence by giving it a name.